Welcome to another episode of the Construction Leading Edge podcast. My name is Todd DeWalt, and my job here is to grow your leadership skills, grow your business, and grow your income. Today, we'll be continuing on with a program that I call the Construction Business Accelerator, where I'm going to talk about just real life, tactical, and strategic stuff to help you grow your business. I did a webinar recently about how to get out of cash flow crunch, where I shared some strategies and tactics on how to get out of cash flow crunch. It came from my experience when I owned my own business, which ultimately I had to close down because of cash flow crunch. And it comes out of my experience of developing some strategies and techniques that I used to grow a construction company. It doubled in revenue and size in about 3.5 years, and it went from being in constant cash flow crunch, constant chaos mode, to having at one point $800,000 or so in retained earnings in the bank, growing relatively smooth, not a lot of chaos to deal with. So these are tested and tried methods that I've actually used. These are not theories. There's no fluff here. These are things that I researched and figured out that actually work to get out of cash flow crunch mode. And in general, what I found with cash flow crunch mode is you don't need to go borrow money. You don't need to get a line of credit. You don't need to go bid more jobs. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. When you find yourself at the bottom of a hole that you've dug, the best thing you need to do first is put down the shovel. You need to stop digging. You got to do things different than what you've done to get yourself into that situation. And what I found is that construction companies have a lot of revenue producing potential that they're not actually realizing. They have equipment, they have labor, they have contracts, they have subcontractors, they have all these resources, but they're operating at a much lower potential than they could be. It's like having a muscle car and you're driving it at 35 miles an hour. It can do a lot more. It can be a lot more interesting, got a lot more potential output, but it's not putting out because you're not operating it at its highest potential. And most construction companies are not operating at anywhere near optimum revenue producing potential because of inefficiency, because of firefighter mode, because of a variety of things. So in a previous installment, I talked about revenue maximization, how to eliminate ticket starvation, and basically make sure that you get paid for everything that you do, because I've seen it over and over and over. Contractors doing work and not getting paid for it, not because of sinister clients, but they're just not billing for it. They do change order work and they don't bill for it. So that's a previous episode. If you haven't listened to that one yet, I would suggest you listen to that. Today we're going to continue talking about how to maximize revenue, and we're going to talk about one of the key resources that you manage in construction. There are a handful of things. You manage time, money, labor, equipment, and information. And today we're going to talk about labor, how to leverage your labor force to maximize their revenue producing potential. So I've got a few strategies I want to talk about today. And again, these are actual tested strategies that work. I don't think it was a fluke, because I've read books about this sort of thing that substantiates what I'm saying. It's based on psychology. It's based on actual experience. This stuff works. Trust me. So what we're going to talk about is how to leverage your labor force, whether you're in cash flow crunch mode or not. Wherever you're at, these are things you can do. But if you find yourself in cash flow crunch mode where you have trouble making payroll, you have trouble paying your bills, you're constantly tapping out a line of credit, then I strongly suggest you look at this, because this is a no-cost way to improve your cash flow and improve the business without taking out a line of credit, without doing really anything other than some minor tweaks to what you've got going on with your people. So what we're going to talk about are a few different areas. we'll just jump into it. So the first thing that you need to do, that I strongly recommend you do, is to set production goals for your crew. Now what does that mean? Well, let me back up. What you need to do is you need to set production goals for your crew and then share them with your crew. But that means you have to do the work to figure out what kind of revenue do you need to be doing, or what is the metric that you can look at, like a speedometer on your car, to say my business is doing what it needs to be doing this week, this month, this quarter, this year. Generally it comes down to revenue. Your overhead is relatively fixed. If you have a labor force, it's relatively fixed. If you have subcontractors, their work is project based. So if you look at, you need to figure out the metric that you can, what's the one thing that you can measure and look at regularly and say we're on track, we're not on track. It could be billable hours if you're a consultant. It could be footage of pipe put in the ground if you're doing a big waterline project. It could be tons of asphalt or square yards of asphalt if you're a paving contractor. But ultimately it's going to come back to revenue. You need to have a certain amount of revenue coming in every month to pay your bills, to make a profit, to cover your overhead. So I would strongly recommend you come up with some revenue targets for the month, for the year. Ultimately it's going to come down to the month and even down to the week. I'm not sure about daily revenue targets, but I would strongly suggest you come up with a monthly revenue target, and then you'll have to do the math to figure that out. You'll have to figure out what are your labor expenses, what are your material expenses, what's your overhead, and what does a typical month of expenses look like. Add a reasonable profit margin on top of that, and you have yourself a revenue target to shoot for. Now this is where it gets, that's hard enough for some people. For some reason, some contractors, I think, don't want to know. They want to bury their head in the sand, and as long as somehow they've got enough money coming in to make payroll and pay their bills, they're fine. But that's kind of a dumb way to do business. I mean, let's be serious here. You need to know what kind of revenue you need to be bringing in every month, and you need to know where you're at. You cannot, it's like looking at if you're taking a long road trip and you just start driving but you don't know where you're supposed to go because you didn't look at a map. That's dumb. And running a business without revenue targets is dumb as well, because you don't know what success looks like. And generally what happens will be you'll run out of money, you'll tap out your line of credit, you'll have subcontractors and suppliers sending you lawsuits, and then you'll know you're not there. To avoid that, set revenue targets and communicate those with your field crew. This gets a little bit hairy for some people, but you need to let your people know what winning looks like. This is a common theme that my guys heard me talk about. This is what winning looks like. You need to let your people know this is what winning looks like. Because in I've seen several situations where people don't know what they're supposed to be doing. In the vacuum of information, if leadership is not telling them what they should be doing, they come up with some idea. I heard a story, actually my brother owns a construction company. He was talking about some guys that were doing some work, and they were doing landscaping work, and they were chugging away doing like X amount of landscaping work. I think they were spreading mulch. Like, yeah, we're spreading 2 loads of mulch a day, or 10 loads of mulch. Let's say I think it was 2 loads of mulch per day. They thought they were rocking and rolling, 2 loads of mulch a day. But the bottom line was, it wasn't, when you added everything up, it wasn't enough to cover the cost. They were losing money every day, and they did that for months, and they just didn't know. So somebody finally realized, hey, this is not working. 2 loads of mulch a day is not working. So they sat down and said, okay, here's what we get for a load of mulch, here's what our costs are for a load of mulch, here's what our labor costs are. And they came to the conclusion that they needed to do 3 loads of mulch. And the look on the guy's face was like, oh my gosh, I thought I thought I was winning all this time. And then you know what? They figured they raised the bar and said we've got to be doing 3 loads of mulch a day, and they did it. They did it. They did 2 loads of mulch a day because they thought that's what they needed to do in order to be profitable. And then when they learned that it was 3 loads of mulch, they were able to do that. So a lot of the problems in construction companies come back to leadership not knowing what winning looks like. They have no idea what their revenue targets are. They don't break it down into production goals that are easily understood and measurable. And then the guys and the gals in the field don't know what winning looks like because leadership doesn't tell them. So it's not their fault. It's not the field crew's fault that they're not that they're not paying the bills because they don't know. It's your job as the leader to tell them, hey, here's the bar, here's what winning looks like. If you do the math, if we don't win for a few months, then that means our expenses will exceed our income. Eventually we run out of money and we all have to find new jobs. People understand that. They understand that kind of logic, and they will work to make it happen. Now what that requires is transparency on the part of the leader or the business owner. And this is where people get a little screwy. This is where people are thinking, I don't know, I can't share revenue targets because people will, my guys will start seeing, we've got to do $300,000 a month in revenue, and they're going to wonder, well, where's all this money going to, and I should be doing this. And a lot of business owners play their cards pretty close to the vest because they don't even want their guys to know how much money they get for a job, or if it's a unit price contract, they're very reluctant to share that information because they're afraid of transparency. I'm here to tell you that transparency is the key to getting your labor force engaged. If you will be transparent with your people and you will tell them, hey, this is what winning looks like. You don't have to tell them your salary. You don't have to tell them how much your personal car payment is. You don't have to tell them how much money you pay in taxes. But you have to say, guys, this is what we need to do to keep this business running, to keep cash flow positive, to be profitable and grow the business. What I've found is that when you set a target for a group of people, and whether it's a scheduled target or a production target, or in this case a revenue target, and you say this is what we need to do this month, it has a tremendous effect on the group. Priorities begin to line up. People understand, oh, this is what the target is. And then they ask questions like, so how are we doing this month? We're halfway through the month. How are we doing on our target? Are we ahead? Are we behind? And they will adjust their effort based on where they're at because they know the target and because they innately want to meet a target. When you set a goal in front of someone, if you have the right people, they will want to achieve that goal, and they will stretch themselves to achieve that goal. Great example of this, we had a crew, and their daily revenue target for this crew was a sewer line rehabilitation crew. They dug and replaced sewer lines down the middle of residential neighborhoods, and they had a target of, I think it was $9,000 or $10,000 per day. That was a good target that we came up with based on the unit prices, and that was they generally delivered that. Well, one day I talked to the superintendent and I said, hey, let's stretch these guys. Let's just throw a challenge out there and see if they can do it. So he went out to the crew and said, I don't think you guys can get to this point up the street. I don't think you can do it. And those guys busted their ass, and not only did they do $10,000 in revenue that day, they didn't do $20,000, they did $43,000 in revenue in one day. Now, some of that was the conditions were good, the weather was good, the equipment was running, but they 4x'd their revenue goal, and those guys were on cloud nine. Now, did any of them complain about how much money they made or how much money the company made off them? No, there was no complaining, but those guys were proud those guys had a sense of satisfaction. They went home happy at the end of the day, and they didn't have their hand out for a bonus, but they knew what winning looks like. They knew where the finish line was, and they absolutely crushed it. And why did they do that? Because we told them what winning looks like, we set a challenge, and they were the right kind of people, and they absolutely crushed the goal. But that requires transparency. See, trust, when you are extending trust to someone, and that's what you're doing when you're sharing revenue goals. You're saying, I trust you with this information. I trust you to be an adult, and I trust that you can handle this kind of information. That is amazing. Trust is a form of currency. You think about, there's several different types of currency. There's time, there's money, there's acknowledgement, and trust. Several other types of currency. But in the business world, specifically when you're dealing with people, and we're talking about how to leverage your labor force, trust is one of, maybe the best motivators of people. It is a very powerful form of currency, and it is an incredibly powerful motivator of people. When you extend trust to people, they are empowered. If you've ever been in a situation where someone trusted you, whether it's a client or a supervisor, when they trust you, you operate much differently than you do when you're being micromanaged and when you're not trusted. So contrast that. There was a guy that I worked with who was the opposite of trust. He had no trust whatsoever. He wanted to control all the information. He wanted to control not only what needed to be done, but he also wanted to control why it was being done. He would even go so far as, if there were a simple little initiative, for example, there was one situation where a piece of equipment needed to be picked up from location A and brought to location B, and then some material needed to be put in that equipment at location B. Well, instead of just telling one person, hey, Larry, go get this piece of equipment from A, take it to B, go pick up this material, put it in the piece of equipment, and then move it to location C. No, he couldn't do that. He told one person to do two parts of the puzzle, told another person to do another couple of parts of the puzzle, and then a third person to do another part of the puzzle. So nobody knew why it was being done. Nobody saw the entire picture, and nobody felt trusted. Nobody felt like they were trusted to take care of the whole process. They were just given little bits and pieces. Therefore, nobody took ownership in it. And what it did was it created opportunities, little gaps between those people, where there was an opportunity for blame to be shifted and fingers to be pointed and say, well, I did my part, and well, he didn't do his part, and then he didn't do his part. And it was a micromanager's dream, but it was an employee's nightmare. So trust your people, be transparent with them, sit down with your key people and say, guys and gals, this is where we need to be this month. Don't feel like when you set a goal that it's going to be set in stone for the rest of your life. This is a monthly target. And what you'll see when you do that is you'll see your people take ownership. You'll see your people understand what the finish line looks like. They'll understand what winning looks like, and you'll see how they operate when you trust them. Now, what this trust will be a little tough for some of you. If you're the typical type A, hard driving, micromanager, maybe even, where you have to have your fingers in everything, then you're going to struggle with this, and you're going to sabotage the process. You're probably going to screw it up. It's going to be a challenge for you, but I'm telling you, it will be completely worth it. But it will stretch you, but you're going to have to suck it up and deal with it. Because if you want to grow your business and you want to get out of cash flow crunch, you're going to have to do things differently than what you've been doing. The stuff you've been doing is not going to take you to a different place. You know, the old definition of insanity is to continue to do the same thing over and over and expect different results. So you're going to have to stretch yourself. You're going to have to make it happen. Now, along with this transparency and trust, what you need to do is create autonomy in your people, in your key people. You need to develop a group of people in your company that can make quality decisions wherever they are. I recently heard an interview with a gentleman, former General Stanley McChrystal. He was a 3 or 4-star general in Afghanistan. He ran the Joint Special Operations Commission, the JSOC. He was responsible for coordinating the different special operations groups within the military between Air Force, Marines, Navy, and Army. And he said he learned that in that situation where things were constantly changing, constantly moving, that he came up with a theorem that was to equip the people closest to the action so that they can make the decisions. What did not work in that situation was a low-ranking soldier seeing something, reporting it to his commanding officer, reporting it to his commanding officer, reporting it back to headquarters, and then waiting for decisions and direction to come back down the chain. There was no time to send something up the chain of command and wait for an answer and come back down to the chain of command. Things just happened too fast, and opportunities were missed. People died. Hopefully people are not dying in construction sites because of this, but I guarantee you that if you have your organization set up so everything has to go through you, then you're slowing down your machine, and your people feel like they're just reporters, and they're not taking ownership in decision making. So where you want to get to is you need to get the people closest to the action, the people on the front lines, on the ditch, on the paver, on the mulch spreader, on the job site, walking around the construction site. Those people need to be equipped to make decisions. Not all decisions, but they need to be equipped to make some decisions. And your job as a leader is you need to start focusing on moving people growing them along the delegation spectrum. See, there's a spectrum of delegation. On one end is the gopher, where they don't make any decisions. You just say, go do this, go do that. No decisions, only execution. The next stage along the delegation spectrum is go check this out, report back to me, and I'll tell you what to do. As you move up the delegation spectrum, it becomes go find out about a situation or bring a situation to me, and then you give me options, and I as the leader will make the decision for you to go execute. Where you want to get your people to is where there's a challenge that came up or some issue that arose, and they assess the situation, they understand what the big picture goals are, they understand what their chain of command is, they understand what their rules of engagement are, and they make quality decisions, they solve the problem, and then they tell you what they did. Now that takes time. You can't just turn people loose and expect them to make quality decisions. But I would encourage you to start looking at your people, figure out where they are right now, where they belong on the delegation spectrum, and then make a concerted effort to move them up to the next level. Now, how do you do that? The way you do that is when someone comes to you with a problem, you think consciously, where are these people at on the delegation spectrum with this particular issue? And then start asking questions. Well, what do you think? Ask when someone comes to you with an issue. Don't feel like you have to solve every little issue that they bring to you. And that's the knee-jerk reaction for a lot of type A problem solver, firefighter type people. Somebody brings you a problem and you solve it. You just say, do this, do this, do this, do this. Start asking questions. Start asking people, well, what do you think? What do you think we should do? And move them to the next phase and say, all right, here's an issue. Okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go come up with 3 options, bring them back to me, and we'll discuss it. Eventually you need to get to your people to the point where they come to you and you say Just go solve it. You take care of it. One of my favorite things that some of my guys, they would joke with me about was something they heard me say a lot was they would bring an issue to me and I would say, I look forward to seeing what you come up with. I look forward to seeing your solution. Meaning, just go take care of it. I don't need to solve this. It's not your job as the leader to solve every problem. It's your job as a leader to grow your people and move them along the delegation spectrum and make them autonomous where they can operate with at the appropriate level of autonomy. Because what I've found, I read a book by a guy named Daniel Pink. The book is called Drive. And he said that autonomy is one of the most powerful motivators for people in the workforce today. And trust and autonomy go hand in hand because people who are autonomous are trusted. And autonomous means they're operating by themselves for the most part in certain situations. It's autonomy is the opposite of being micromanaged. I had a micromanager. I had a job where I was actually in business development. One of my most frustrating stories was with this micromanager of mine was it's so ridiculous. There was a folder on a shared drive on a network somewhere, and for some reason I needed this guy asked me to transfer stuff out of one folder into another folder and then delete the old folder. To me, it was relatively useless. It was really low on the priority list. I was a business development guy, so my job was to help customers, go find new customers, provide technical support, all these sorts of things. Well, this guy, he emailed me a few times about it and kept asking me, hey, did you delete that folder? Did you delete that folder? So finally I called him and I said, Mark, what's the big deal with this folder? Is this really a problem? And he was a micromanager, so he said, well, I asked you to do it. It's just really important that you do it. And I got reprimanded over that. I actually got a phone call from human resources with him over this chicken shit issue. And it was the entire organization smacked of micromanagement. There was no trust. We who are on the front lines dealing with customers, dealing with technical issues, had no decision-making ability. So we were completely handcuffed. We were like a hunting guide who would point to an opportunity, and then we're like a bird dog who would say, here's an opportunity, here's a new customer, and then hand it off to the folks back in the office who generally would botch it because they had the complete wrong attitude when it came to developing new business. But that's a whole different story. But there was, if you're not careful, if you're a type A, hard-driving micromanager, then you will create a culture of micromanagement. So along the subject of autonomy, this one will move the needle. If you can get your people to be autonomous, whether you're dealing with your assistant in the office, or your mechanic in the shop, or your superintendent in the field, or your operator, or your laborer, think about where they're at and what decisions they can make, whether it be safety or production or quality. When people are empowered and they're autonomous, when they feel trusted, they will be so much more productive because that's when they own it. Then they become an owner. And speaking of ownership, I worked for an employee-owned construction company for about 5 years, and it is a completely different dynamic because everybody is vested in the company. They are employee owners, and it just works. Now, you don't necessarily have to make your company an employee-owned company to do that, but you can give your people a measure of ownership by allowing them to be autonomous. So ask questions like, what do you think? Make a concerted effort to move your people, look at each person, figure out where they are on the delegation spectrum, and make it a point to move them and stretch them from where they're at to the next stage of the delegation spectrum. Another thing that you need to do in order to leverage your labor force is you have to create a safe place to work. Not just OSHA type safety. I'm talking about people need to feel safe. They need to feel like their job, their livelihood, and their ability to provide for their family are safe with you. I've been in organizations where that safety was there, and I've been in organizations where it was completely absent. And I can tell you, being in a situation where you don't know at any point, any week could be your last week because of corporate cutbacks or new leadership or the whim of some senior leader, I'm telling you, that is not a good place to be. Simon Sinek wrote a book called Leaders Eat Last. If you haven't read the book, I strongly recommend you read it. And in that book, he says that it's the leader's job, and in fact, one of the definitions of a leader is that they make the person on the left of them and on the right of them feel safe. Whether it's he talks a lot about in the military context, but he also talks about in a work context. Leadership is making people feel safe. And the reason that's so important to your company and your situation is that if your people don't feel safe, let's think about it. There was a young man that worked for me. His name is David. Very sharp guy. He had a family of 5 kids at the time. I started working with this company that he was with, and he began reporting to me. He had a sixth child during our time together, and frankly, he never knew. He was at risk of being fired at any point. He didn't know if this was his last week or not, because the ownership of the company just seemed to have it in for him. And what happened was he spent a significant amount of his mental energy worrying about making a mistake, worrying about getting fired, either for something he did, something he didn't do, or some illusion that he had absolutely nothing to do with. So on the job, he was constantly tight, afraid to make decisions. And this particular company had a culture of fear, and every decision got pushed off to somebody else. The guys in the field did not want to make a decision because they were afraid that it may cost their job, and it was safer for them to push everything else to someone else and sit and wait for a decision. So here's David, young man with a young family, 5, 6 kids, and he didn't know if every Tuesday when he got his paycheck, if that was going to be his last paycheck. He fully expected every week to get handed his paycheck and to be told, we don't need you anymore. And he lived in a constant state of anxiety, a constant state of fear, and he just wasn't that productive. I've seen guys who were afraid of losing their job, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their fear of losing their job actually made them lose their job. That's strange, but I've seen it over and over. Guys who are afraid of losing their job end up losing their job because they're so uptight, and they're so prone to mistakes because they're nervous about everything. Now contrast that with someone who's confident and comfortable, not complacent, but comfortable. They're confident that their employer's watching out for their back. They're not going to get blindsided. That person is seeing the whole field. They are making good decisions. They're not afraid to make a decision because they know that one bad decision is not going to cost them their job. Now this goes all the way down to the physiological level. There have been studies that are shown when you are scared, when you're anxious, when you're scared, when something seems to be threatening you, there's a chemical that's released in your body called cortisol. And cortisol is the fight or flight chemical. It's a hormone, I think it's a hormone, that gets released in your body, and it causes you to have tunnel vision. And it actually makes your the logical decision-making part of your brain somewhat shut down. Because imagine if you are on some set of railroad tracks, and suddenly you're walking along the railroad tracks, and suddenly you hear the train whistle, and you see it's at night, and you see a bright light coming at you. You don't stop and think, I wonder what the train schedule says. I wonder which train this is. Or you don't do calculations in your head to figure out how much time you have. No, and you don't worry about what you had for lunch yesterday. You're not worried about whether you left the windows in your truck rolled down or not. You are only concerned about getting off the railroad tracks and saving your skin. To some degree, that happens to people who are afraid of losing their job. They have this constant, it feels like a tightness in their chest, knot in their stomach. It is a physiological issue, and it's caused in part by cortisol. And it makes it impossible for people to make good decisions. It is physically impossible for people to make good decisions when they have cortisol running through their body, because cortisol's job is to shut down, to some degree, the logical part of the brain and engage the fight or flight mode. Fight or flight is not a good mode for your people to operate in. You want them to make good logical decisions. So it's your job to create an environment where it's safe. I'm not saying that you have to keep people around forever. I hate what I call sanctioned incompetence, keeping people around who are incompetent and are not doing their job. It's your job as a leader to make sure that doesn't happen. So I'm not saying you have to keep people around who aren't doing their job. That needs to be solved. But people need to know that their job is safe, that you've got their back. They need to know that you've got their back, that you're going to be watching out for them as the leader, that you're going to take good care of them. If they do what they're supposed to do, then you're going to watch out for their back, and you're going to help keep them safe. That's what your job is as a leader. I came across something recently that goes along with this. There's a gentleman back in the 70s and 80s. His name is Masao Nemoto, and he was the managing director of Toyota. He was one of the people who spearheaded a lot of the efforts to develop total quality control and just-in-time production at Toyota. And he came up with his 10 principles of leadership, Nemoto's 10 principles of leadership. And one of the principles of leadership that he came up with is a concept he called do not scold. Do not scold. And I'll just read this passage to you. An alien concept to most managers. At Toyota, the policy is for superiors to avoid giving criticism and threatening punitive measures when mistakes are made. This is the only way to ensure that mistakes will be reported immediately and fully, so that the root causes in policies and processes can be identified and amended. Assigning blame to the reporter clearly discourages reporting of mistakes and makes it harder to find the underlying cause of a mistake. But it is difficult to train managers to take this approach. So this is the do not scold method, and this is tough. If you're a business owner and you find out about a mistake that was made, let's say your foreman comes to you and he's like, my crew messed up and it's going to cost $10,000. That's a tough one to take. But my question for you is, would you rather your crew tell you about a mistake that was made so it can be fixed, or would you rather them hide it and then go to great lengths to cover that mistake up so that it will get buried under other work and come up much later and cost a whole lot more money? Another common situation that I've seen is damage to equipment. Would you rather your people tell you that something was damaged? Let's say it's a truck that has an engine problem or has a transmission problem. Would you rather your people tell you about a problem so that it can be fixed early? Or would you rather them hide it and pass the buck and try to hope somebody else gets blamed for it, and then it costs you a lot more money down the road? Well, I'm here to tell you, if you go off the handle and you blow up at people when they tell you about a mistake, or they tell you about damage that was done to a piece of equipment or to something on a job site that was done improperly, if you blow up on them, then you can be sure they're not going to share bad news with you. Okay? You don't shoot the messenger. You don't kill the guy who's reporting it. In fact, you want to know when something has been damaged. You want to know when mistakes are made. You need to encourage your people. You need to reward them for telling you about those sort of things, because in my experience, when a mistake's made or something's damaged, it doesn't magically fix itself. Generally, when there's a mistake, the thing grows legs, it grows hair, it gets big, it walks around, it causes lots of other problems, and something that could have been fixed for $10,000 on day one, if you wait 6 months, it could be a $50,000 issue or more. I want to know about problems as early as possible. I want my people to tell me when something's screwed up, because I don't want to hear about it from my customer. I don't want to hear about it 6 months later, and I certainly don't want to hear about it if it's an equipment issue and there's some catastrophic event and somebody gets hurt or somebody gets killed, and it could have been avoided with some preventative maintenance. So do not scold your people. Do not do anything that would discourage your people from reporting problems to you. They need to know that you want to know that stuff. You want to know where the problems are. There will be problems. We're in the business of solving problems. We're in the business of making things worse in some cases just to make them better. So you've got to encourage your people to tell you when there are problems. I'm not saying you need to give them a cash bonus, but they need to feel safe. And when you have people who are operating autonomously, who are taking ownership, and who understand what the goals are of the company, then they're going to realize, hey, the boss needs to know about this. The owner, you need to know about this. You may not want to hear about it, but you need to know, because it's in your best interest to know about those sort of things. So, to recap, create a safe place for your people to operate. They need to know that their jobs are safe. You need to create transparency so that people understand what winning looks like, and you need to create autonomy. You need to focus on growing your people, moving them along the delegation spectrum so that you can be in a situation where the people closest to the action can make good quality decisions. That wraps up this episode of the podcast. Again, this one has been all about leveraging your labor force as part of the Construction Business Accelerator. If you have any questions or comments about this, I would encourage you, send me an email, todd@constructionleadingedge.com. If you're listening to this podcast, maybe you're a new listener, I would encourage you, go to constructionleadingedge.com/nation. Sign up there to become a CLE Nation member, and you'll get insider access to some of the things we have going on behind the scenes. Something that I've set up recently is I have a private Facebook group set up for construction leaders, and it's a place where we can share ideas, share resources, get help when we get stuck. So if you want to know more about that, send me an email, todd@constructionleadingedge. If you're in the construction business and you're a leader, it doesn't matter what level you're at in the construction industry, you're welcome to join. Some of the rules are there's no bitching, no complaining, and no selling. This is not a place for you to sell your wares to construction people. This is a place for us to help each other solve our problems and grow our businesses. Follow me on Twitter @ConLeadEdge. And I think that's about it. Until next time, my name is Todd DeWalt. This is the Construction Leading Edge podcast. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks, guys.